All right, now we're going to talk about citing sources and using supporting material within a speech. You want to use a variety of sources within your speech, and that key word there is variety. This tells the audience that you have thoroughly studied your topic, that you've gone into depth in your research, and that you know what you're talking about. So more than one source gives you deeper credibility than if you used one source alone. So you want to look for multiple sources from different publications in order to have that variety. You also need to make sure that you cite your sources orally within a speech. In other words, you say out loud where your information came from. This is a professional thing to do. It helps build your credibility. And then, of course, for academic purposes, it helps you avoid plagiarism. And it is a part of the grade within a speech. Not every bit of supporting material you use will be something that you need to cite. Sometimes you're going to use things that just come from your own mind, things like examples. So these are just illustrations that help define what you're talking about. They may be very brief, take only a few seconds. They may be a bit longer. Extended examples may take a minute or two to explain. You have factual and you have hypothetical examples. Hypothetical meaning it hasn't actually happened, but it is a very realistic situation. And then factual examples would be examples of things that have actually happened. You can also use stories as a form of supporting material. These stories may be your own or they may be someone else's. If you're using someone else's stories, you need to give them the proper credit. If you are using your own stories, obviously they're yours, so you don't have to cite anything. But stories can be used in many different contexts, and a big part of this and why it's so useful is that we retain information that we learn through story form. And we retain it longer than just about any other method of learning. So stories are great for teaching or exemplifying things. Anecdotes are shortened versions of stories. They kind of get to the point very quickly. There's no time for setup or character background or story background. You just get to the point very quickly. That's an anecdote. Testimony is another type of supporting material that you can use. And we have two different types of testimony here. You have expert testimony, which is testimony that comes from a trained observer or researcher, a professional in the field. And then you have lay testimony. This is testimony that comes from those who are not trained experts, but they may have seen something themselves or experienced it themselves. So lay testimony sounds a little bit strange, but that word lay there, if you have ever heard of layman's terms, or layperson's terms, it means every person, any person. It just is a general human being, non-specialized. It's important whenever you're using testimony to indicate who the person is and why you're citing them or quoting them. List their credentials if it's an expert. But the reason you do this is so that the audience can decide how much importance they're going to place on this testimony. So you need to define who the testimony is coming from. Another good way to get information across to the audience is through statistics. Statistics are a great way to share information, but also to gain attention. With statistics, they're numbers, so you can show how big a problem is. A lot of times you will want to incorporate a visual aid to accompany statistics, because a lot of times it's easier to understand numbers when we can see them or see a graph that represents them. Another very important thing is to make sure that your statistics are used in context. In other words, they're used in the manner that they were intended to be used, displaying the information correctly. You don't want to cherry pick your statistics or your sources in general. To cherry pick simply means to only pick sources or statistics that are going to support your side, when there may be plenty of really good arguments to the opposing side, but to just dismiss them wholeheartedly is somewhat unethical. So you want to be careful about that. We'll talk more about that concept, the concept of talking about the opposition when we get into persuasion. There are two types of research that we can do. We can do primary or secondary research. Primary research is research conducted by you. It's where you conduct interviews or surveys. It's where you jump through all the legal loopholes or hoops and you get published. That's primary research. Primary research is very difficult and time-consuming, and to do it in an academic environment, there are a lot of different rules that you have to adhere to. It's not going to be worth it for this class, but when you get into your respective fields, into upper-level coursework, you may be able to do some primary research for projects. What you'll be doing is secondary research, which is looking up information that others have provided. So there is a wealth of knowledge out there that has been collected and shared with you through the library, through different databases, in different journals. So that's the type of research you'll do for this class, is secondary research. You'll find periodicals of various type. A periodical is a publication that comes out every set period of time. Could be daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually, biannually, but every set period of time. So you have things like newspapers, and that is a periodical, and to a certain extent trustworthy, but it's not academic. You'll want to look for things like academic journals if you're looking for academic peer-reviewed sources, and you'll find those through the library. Magazines are another periodical. Again, not very academic in nature, so you want to be careful about what magazines you choose if you're doing any kind of coursework. Another type of supporting material you can use is information gathered through interviews. For this class, you probably won't have occasion to use this, maybe for your informative speech, but you would only be able to do one for that speech if you did choose to do so. And if you do choose to do an interview, please get with me and we can discuss that. And then just in general, you want to keep up with all the work that you're quoting and referencing and who said what and where that information came from. Keep up with it while you're writing. Otherwise, you may end up accidentally plagiarizing or just end up with a headache trying to track down the sources after the fact. So keep up with it as you go. Obviously, you want to avoid that plagiarism, so you need to cite your sources orally and in writing. Cite them both through the spoken word and the written word during a speech. When you're choosing your source, think about these things. What's the author's background? How credible is the publication? How reliable is the data? How recent is the reference? Because generally the newer the information, the better off you are. Things like medicine have changed dramatically in the last 5 years, even 5 to 10 years. So if you were doing a report on a medical procedure and your sources were coming out of the 1950s, chances are your information is outdated. The way we determine if something is reliable, reliability of the data, is to see if you can find that data repeated anywhere. If it is in more than one place and it is very similar information, chances are it is somewhat reliable. If you only find one source that says it, chances are something has been taken out of context or there was a problem with the experiment. When it comes to the credibility of the publication, the name says a lot of a publication. If it is an academic journal, then it's probably going to be fine. If it is a magazine, well, you may not want to place as much credibility in that publication. I've said this several times now. You need to orally cite your sources. Here's a method for you. While you're citing your sources, you state the point that you are trying to make. So this is your perspective. I believe this. Then you identify your source according to the Wall Street Journal or whatever your source may be. Then you state the content. What did they say? And the last step, explain the importance or how that content ties back to your point. So it's a very simple process. You just need to make sure that you cite your source orally. Tell us where the information came from. It's very important. Some sources to avoid, just in general, whenever it comes to academic reporting, things like blogs, forums, anything that says wiki, about.com, howstuffworks.com, and the Huffington Post. Those are all sources that you need to avoid, at least for my class, but probably for most classes. With the first 5 listed there, they're all forum-based, where you can just go in and create an account, and you can write a post. And the thing is, you just can't trust that when a person says that they've been doing this for 20 years, that they actually have. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are an expert. And so those are all considered to be somewhat unreliable sources. Huffington Post is a light news source. They don't have a lot of the fact-checking safeguards in place that other news sources do. And so you want to be careful about using that as a source as well.